Hi, everyone. This is Raquel.
Hi, and this is Jennifer.
Welcome to Madness Cafe.
This is a feminist podcast where we talk about women's issues, politics, and health and wellness.
And where those issues intersect. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Madness Cafe. I'm sure everybody has realized at this point in our society that things are quite nuts lately, and that's putting it mildly, politically in the US and in quite a few areas around the world. Politics is just off its hinges right now, and I want to read a blurb to you really quick. Around the world, populism, extremism, and supremacy crimes like US mass shootings are on the rise. Ever wonder what they have in common? The through line is aggrieved manhood, a seething sense that masculinity is under attack and must be restored. Wronged and dangerous reframes this feeling from political position to public health problem. It traces how the feeling has gone viral, literally, and suggests what can be done about it. No matter your gender, you have a stake in the story of our common future. Now, the book that I just noted, the full title is Wronged and Dangerous: Viral Masculinity and the Populist Pandemic. It's written by our guest, Karen Lee Ashcraft. She is a professor of communication at the University of Colorado Boulder. She grew up in the lap of evangelical populism, and her research examines how gender interacts with class, race, sexuality, and more to shape organizational and cultural politics. That is a very tall order, and we are here to get all up in that. Karen, thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you for being here with us to talk about this.
Thank you for that lovely intro, and let's get into it.
In reading this book, I'm going to admit to everybody right now, it was a little bit over my head. And I took a lot away from it. I wrote a lot of notes. I have 100 questions. I know we're not going to get to all of them. But what I would like...
that. Yeah, I highlighted the whole book, people. Just about the whole freaking book.
Okay, that's evidence.
But if you could start by just telling us a little bit about you and how you came to write this.
Oh my goodness. I feel like this is a book I never set out to write. And at the same time, I realize now I've been revving up to write it for much of my life. So like many projects I've at least encountered lately, it's a pandemic-born book. I was scheduled to give an address at a conference that, of course, went virtual. It was like June 2020. And they asked the keynote speakers to adjust their talks to 15-minute provocations about gender and the pandemic. And these were virtual talks. And so that's where the idea was born. And because it was virtual, the audience was much bigger. And there were some folks there who asked the Bristol folks who published this, do you think there's a book to this? And I was like, why not? I happen to be on sabbatical. I have time. I've researched this for a long time. Let's see. And that's how I started doing it.
Wow, that is a great story.
It's how it happened. And I wrote it in a year, and I never would have been able to do that if I were not on sabbatical and didn't have like the travel and the distractions. And it honestly, given all that was going on in that period, gave me an outlet of focus, a sense of like, let's put this energy somewhere.
Yeah, I love this book so much. And I honestly, I really do. Like I was telling Jennifer earlier, this touches my little nerd heart in so many ways. Yeah, I mean, if you can just, to get us started, can you give us an idea, a little nugget about what populism is as it is showing up in the US and in the world right now? Because I feel it's a little bit different than what we historically have thought of as populism.
Okay. So if I do this in nugget form, I would say populism is a political label and form that is generally recognized by the contrast, like the vocabulary and contrast of the people, like the
Mhm.
ordinary masses,
Mhm.
versus the elite or the establishment, right?
Right. Mhm.
In this case, the kind of populism that we are seeing now, which is different historically, is leaning to the far right, right?
Mhm.
Far right,
Mhm.
harder
Way
right.
far, all the way,
Okay. Kind
all
of
the way
continually
right.
turning right.
Girl, keep
And
turning.
in that case, there is kind of another element to it. So it's not just the people versus the elite establishment, but it's also a third party, which you could call the others with a capital O. And the thing is, like, the people are the ones who are entitled to, let's say, their country and to rule for the common good. But the story goes that the others are invading or taking over or somehow inappropriately like crossing that wall. And worse, the establishment, the elite, are helping them do this, helping
Mhm.
them rob the people. Like, that's the basic narrative line of the kind of what many people call right-wing populism or new populism that we see nowadays.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
You started the book talking about gender. Why did you start there?
I love that question because I agonized over that question. I felt a few things. One, most folks, when you start talking about gender, assume you're talking about men and women. That still
Mhm.
seems to be the case. So the analytics fall to questions like, okay, you're talking about what men and women do. And if women do it, if women support new populism too, how can it be about gender? Right. So I
Right.
felt that we needed an updated model that got some of the old reservations out of the way. And specifically, what we needed is a model that moves past the gender binary without denying that men and women and other genders exist, but shows how gender is related to like sensation and feeling and kind of like physical compulsions and urgencies as men, women, and other genders. And I just felt that that needed a devoted section and kind of a warm up for those to whom gender analysis would be new and who might find these kinds of things like a little bit too much. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
Yes.
the other piece for me is that it's so uncommon in this conversation about contemporary politics to do anything other than make little sideshow observations about gender, like jokes that came out of January 6th, for instance, or the January 8 insurrection in, Brazil. And people are like, look at all those angry white dudes, but it never goes further as an explanatory device, right? And so to do that, I just felt that you needed more of a foundation as a reader. And I was not assuming a gender studies reader at all.
Mhm.
So kind of just wanted that ramp up, if you will. And then the next section enters the way we're currently making sense of it, which is populism.
One thing that stuck out for me, and I'm probably going to be jumping around a lot, so my apologies.
I'm good with it.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Specifically where it comes to gender and populism, you talk in the book, and God, I love this so much. You talk about how you would think that women would not be supportive of this new populism, but they are. And you talk about not all women, obviously, but you talk about why some women, and yes, more specifically, cis het white women, will lean toward this when it would seem that this would be directly in conflict with their best interest as women. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because I hear that question a lot, like why does this happen? I mean, I've even had the same question. I've asked that in one shape or another, I'm sure 1,000 times. Just watching the news, you can't help but ask these questions. So can you talk about that a little bit?
I sure can. Can I start by just acknowledging openly that I was one of those women and young girls So I was kind of ushered into this through my family as a young child and participated in our evangelical and then Christian fundamentalist church in a lot of the dynamics that I write about. So while I certainly left them in my adult life, I can come at it from an embodied place as well. So I think maybe that's an important thing to admit, that I'm not all scholar analysis on this. I also know by heart,
Yeah.
Okay.
And actually, once we finish with this question, I'd love to hear how you made that switch.
Oh,
in
yeah,
your own,
sure.
in your own life. So
Sure. Okay. Put a pin in that. Yeah. So I guess my first answer to that would be that heterosexuality is so critical to this, right? That women, like you mentioned, cis, hetero, et cetera, women often get invested in these dynamics through men, like vicariously through men. Let's say by having young boys themselves, or as wives or partners or financial partners and beneficiaries, as daughters, like in my case, that was a powerful pull. So you can, I like to say to people, have you met heterosexuality? It would never be a surprise that women get involved in these things because they are invested literally and figuratively in men's lives and often come to read their own interests through those interests, if that makes any sense. I'm also thinking here, I'm sure you're familiar with Isabel Wilkerson's Caste book. And there's a quote in there that just really, really struck me because it so beautifully pulls this together. And it's like, never ask why any group is involved in something that seems to be against their interests, right? Like blacks for Trump, women for Trump, right? Because her phrase was, a sentinel at every rung is how any caste system is maintained. Like the system will hold out little carrots for you to get invested, pay you some side benefits, and you're in, right? You just have to come to see a stake in it. Yeah. That's it.
Yep. That makes sense. And that's a hard thing to figure out.
It is. To be honest, this is why we have to understand gender in terms of sensation, sentiment, and feeling, the emotional investments that we make in it, through it, in its name, like that come out our mouths, right? So I think that also explains the first part of the book. I'm trying to get people to see that angle on gender and not just, if I'm a woman, I should only do things that are in so-called women's interests, right?
Right. Wow. Yeah.
What about our pin? We put a pin in it.
We put a pin.
Oh yeah, the pin. The pin was in. What was the question about how I got out?
Yeah. How did you go from basically being raised, as you said, in the lap of evangelical Christian world to writing this book, which is very much not.
And it's actually maybe something else we could put a pin in is that I see this book also as like a love letter to those people who raised me. Like I'm trying to write it in a spirit in which I invite them to think about it differently. But anyway, okay. How did I get it?
I saw that and I felt that in the writing.
You did?
I did.
Okay.
I did.
All right.
Absolutely.
That's good. I suppose there's maybe a slightly fun irony to this, which is my parents, by virtue of the kind of, we were like survivalists and Christian fundamentalists. And so they did not believe that women really needed an education beyond high school. When I wanted to go to college, they didn't really want to pay for me to go to, they probably couldn't have either, but the idea was like, go to a local commuter school, So I actually graduated from Cal State Hayward. And it's this incredibly diverse commuter school where I encountered not only all kinds of exciting social thinking, critical race, feminist, queer theory, movements, etc. So their plan for my education, ironically, turned me in to this sort of person. And so I ended up in that process.
Mom and Dad.
Yeah. And we have actually joked about this at home that like, didn't that turn out funny? So, they'll smile every now and then. And that became kind of my path toward grad school, rethinking, studying this stuff for a living. So, yeah.
Wow. So what's their reaction to the book? Have they read it?
My mother is in the process of reading it, and her last comment to me was, I have many questions and scribblings, but we are in conversation. And so I consider that to be
That's awesome.
A mini victory that is not small. Mini,
Big
but not
one.
small.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
a huge win.
Yeah. The rest of my family I'm not aware that they've read it. I think they are aware of it. We tend to avoid kind of political topics when we converse as a way of staying in relationship. So
Yeah, it's probably safer that way. Yeah.
Would you tell us about the puffer fish in your book?
I would love to tell you about that. And can I ask if you're asking because it seems strange or because okay.
I'm asking because I really liked it as the example.
Okay. That helps me know where to start.
Yeah, it was a really great vehicle for the book.
For your listeners, most people can picture a pufferfish. I don't know. If you can't, you should look one up because it really, like, the image is so powerful. So it's a family of fish that basically swells, fills itself full of water, and gets barbs and spikes. And in response to any sort of threat that it perceives, and it's a bluffing behavior that covers up its vulnerability, and often effectively so. And biologists refer to it as dymatic behavior. So it's supposed to be kind of functional for the species, right? But the issue is with pufferfish in particular, because all kinds of species show this, but pufferfish in particular are so toxic that sometimes, even if they're defeated, they take down their opponent in death. But also, the more they puff up, the more toxic they get. And so they can kill themselves with this toxicity. So it's like a self-defeating self-defense behavior. If you're not beginning to get the metaphor, that's kind of it, right? So there's a reason I chose not just any creature that does this, but the pufferfish, because of the toxicity. In the book, I work through some in-depth physical examples, but then kind of chain it out to a range of things. Like if you think about anti-masking and some of the initial kind of viral episodes of men saying, like, you can't tell me to do this, like flaring out, I feel threatened, like, get back. Anti-masking, climate destruction behavior. Like in the book, I talk about rolling coal, literally blowing smoke out to say, like, screw your climate change stuff. I'm going to have this is actually a term, a climate damaging lifestyle, So in other words, to any effort to call masculinity into vulnerability, what I call in the book Aggrieved Manhood, says, fuck no. And instead I'm doubling down, right?
Yeah.
Like real men. And this happens in relation to gun violence, gun suicide, climate behavior, political behavior.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is as I was working through the pufferfish, like, in one of those writing moments when you're just kind of stuck, I happened to find that there is an entire website devoted to putting Donald Trump's face onto pufferfish. Because in fact, yes, you must look this up because it's fabulous. But in fact, other folks had gotten that sensory connection, right?
Yeah.
And I went down this kind of rabbit hole of looking at, like, all around the world, populist leaders' mouths and, like, also their kind of physical kind of expressions.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to do the work. Like, other people have compiled these reels to kind of show this physical bluffing behavior. So it's a metaphor. The pufferfish is a metaphor for what I'm describing, the kind of self-defense against vulnerability that what I've called aggrieved manhood represents. But it is also something more than metaphor, I think. I think it is a highly dysfunctional dymatic behavior, basically, a bluffing behavior.
I've seen it.
Oh, yeah. Well, we all have. If not in our own lives, then definitely on the news. And definitely in our former president.
Yes. Yes, and an aesthetic of politics that he inspired, right? That is and will continue to, I think, surpass him. right?
Oh, absolutely. It
Yeah.
already is.
Yeah. And as you know, the book is kind of tracing, it's also a global aesthetic. It's
Hmm.
shared
Hmm.
among
Right.
many movements that have kind of similar themes. Yeah.
Right. I really wish, I mean, especially talking about the news, I really wish that journalists or talking heads or whatever you want to call them, whoever's reporting on the news, or at least politics, would read this book, because I think it would have a huge effect on the way that they report the news, at least for, most
Yeah.
news channels,
Mhm.
basically. For instance, you talk about coming at this with empathy from the side
Yeah.
as opposed to
Yeah.
empathy from the front. Can you talk about that, and then maybe kind of talk about how coming at it from the side can actually help us to
Yes.
understand what new populism really is
Yeah.
and how we can react to it in a better way?
Let me start with
That's
your,
probably a big question.
no, I think the observation about journalism is such an important one. So I want to underscore that to me is one of the many sites of intervention coming out of the book and the idea of critical feeling that I introduced, which is the very first thing we need to do is start calling this by its name. And, I'm not really into like what is and is not populism. I'm not trying to draw some rigid boundary around it. But what we are calling right-wing populism, that is a misnomer. It's a cover. It gives like a little distinguished cloak, basically, a hideout to
Mhm.
what I would suggest is the deeper animating feeling, which is aggrieved manhood, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
every time people say the rise of the far right, right-wing populism, they are allowing aggrieved manhood to wear the people's mask. And I find
Mhm.
this like journalists are at it, journalistic practices, I don't need to blame particular journalists, are heavily in on the phenomenon by
Mhm.
refusing to name it and see it, even when often in many cases, every single figure before their eyes is a white man. And yet
Mhm.
we don't talk about that part of the dynamic. I just want to
Mhm.
agree with you there. Now, when you mentioned empathy from the side versus from the front, like one of the things I like to start with, I don't know if you all read, it's been a few years now, Arlie Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, which was this like
Mm.
bestseller that came out around the time of Trump's election. And so it was a
Ooh.
bestseller because everybody was like trying to turn to it to understand, what is this? What's happening?
Right.
And ultimately where she goes in this analysis, even though there's several moments of the book when she says, okay, it's basically like these populist movements are identity politics for white men and their wives, and
Mhm.
yet she lands on class somehow as like an explanation for this, or perceived class and cultural issues related to that, and calls for empathy, calls for us to, her term is like, cross the empathy wall and really try to understand where these folks are coming from, try to understand why they feel this way, try to understand the content of their claims. And that is what I am not calling for. That's what I would
Mhm.
call empathy from the front.
Mhm.
And it's for the person. I'm all about compassion, absolutely. But I think what we need to do is start bracketing the content, like
Mhm.
bypass the blustering symptom, all the puffiness and what they're
Mhm.
calling for and what they're saying, and be like, kind of like, shh, but what else is going on? Like, what's
Yes.
behind that? And where is that
Yes.
feeling going? And what does that feeling want? And once you realize that, in all this kind of conversation we just had about puffer fishery, and what the feeling wants is basically to reinstate its status as white male entitlement, this
Mhm.
impermeable, self-contained man, and it will go down fighting for that. It will
Right.
take the
Right.
planet with it, right? And so
Yeah.
once you realize that, there really isn't such a point in taking up with the content and arguing with it. The question is, how is that feeling? How is that compulsion traveling in the world? And maybe that's another
Mhm.
thing we can talk about. How is it traveling? That's what the book is about. bracket what it says to track how it spreads. Switch from content to movement. Start asking why so many, when everybody said, not everybody, the sociologist Michael Kimmel, let me give a name to it, in 2014 wrote a book called, or 13, I don't know which, wrote a book called Angry White Men. Okay. And then in 2017, did another version where he's like, okay, yeah, I thought it was dying. It's not dying, but it's on its last legs. And it's like, no, it is not on its last legs. And in fact, it's a booming business, and it is attracting youth in a way it has not been able to in like ever since the start of men's movements in the 70s. So we need to ask not what's it saying, but how is it spreading? And that is empathy from the side. You look at, that's why I use the term viral masculinity instead of toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity, which has done a lot of important work, has us kind of looking around for the latest toxic mouthpiece and maybe saying like, ooh, bad Andrew Tate, bad this, like, oh, keep boys from ingesting this ideology. And that, I think, is a misguiding metaphor. What we have in front of us is a widespreading, circulating, like community spread viral masculinity. And you've got to tackle that differently. You have to look at how feeling goes communicable like a virus and slow the spread. That's empathy from the side. So it's almost like bringing what I would call like a pandemic frame to the spread of feeling. Don't empathize with the content, care for the way it's moving from body to body. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Absolutely.
And how is it moving from body to body? Is it because everyone's on the internet?
That is just like the best lead in, because yes and no, right? I do not want to be, especially as like a communication scholar, I'm not allowed. I would never say tech did it, tech's to blame. The internet did it. It certainly isn't that simple. But what is the late 2000s to around 2015, 16 is when this exploded. That is the period in which it exploded. And it's no coincidence that that is also the period in which right-wing populism began in like mass, quickly erupting all over the globe. And that relationship is something I am tracking and exploring throughout the book. And so what happened during that period is something called, this is not my term, other people use it, the manosphere was born. So the manosphere is basically like the internet phase of anti-feminist men's movements from the 70s that were then stoked through outrage media, like think Rush Limbaugh, right? But then like they hit the internet. And at first we're talking like chat rooms for men, not that consequential, kind of seems grumpy, crusty, older men, older white men for the most part. But then with the rise of these new platforms and the way that bodies are interacting with them, I mean, my argument is that a new communication circuitry was born. And a way of looking at this is to think about like probably the way that the manosphere has most come into popular consciousness was through Gamergate, if anybody remembers that, like in the 2014, this the first of many. Now it's so common that we don't even cover it really. But the first of many like massive trolling campaigns, basically anti-feminist trolling campaigns. That was not, as lots of digital culture folks have shown, scholars have shown, that was not about like ideology per se. It was like, ooh, shitpost, SWAT, docs, like the physical thrill and rush. The gaming culture, for example, of many young boys was a perfect audience for this, right? Redirect them toward anti-feminist trolling online. And out of that grew this like, hey, you know who has it the worst these days? Straight white Western, depending on where you live, Christian men. And so the manosphere,
life is so hard for them.
Yes. And that is what the manosphere, which is now like the way I'm using that term is not just as an online thing because it has skipped offline, but it is like this kind of mesh or this hive of all kinds of different groups, websites, blogs, videos. Andrew Tate is just one recent kind of visible example but
Right.
there are 1,000 influencers like him and 1,000 groups that are warring and conflicting and spreading all these granular versions of exactly what you just said, Raquel. They have it so hard. And this is how they have it hard. And they're spreading those stories. So the manosphere becomes a super spreader of this feeling. And around 2015, when we started talking about the alt-right in that in the US presidential election, that's when it began to skip offline and enter mainstream politics. And so those online culture wars that raged during that period are likely much more responsible for what we see now than the things people point to, like the Great Recession and other things.
Right. Okay. And yeah, hindsight is 2020. We can all look back and, oh, if we'd done this, maybe this wouldn't have happened. But I can't help but ask. It feels like the rise of all this, the rise of aggrieved manhood and the spreading of it is in direct relation to developments and of movements and gaining of rights and things like that. And 100%. Is there a way that the rights of all of the others with the capital O, like you said, which includes all of us, we're all women, people of other genders, Black and brown folks who are different in any way. Was there any way that all of those rights could have been developed where it would not have touched off this aggrieved manhood? Or is aggrieved manhood just it's just gonna happen? It's just inevitable.
What a big and deep question. So let me just come back to the question as I understand it, which is, this is a response to many social movements that were absolutely essential, critical, gaining just basic, much less deeper
necessary
rights for all the others with a capital O, right? So we're thinking queer movements, civil rights movements, and then opening up. So I'm mentioning this because I want us to sit in the long history of this. It is literally, I don't know how old you are, but I'm 50-ish. And it is my lifetime in which this feeling has been simmering and building. So you are correct that it is a response to social movements of a range of kinds from the 60s and 70s, where it's like, okay, they unsettled the entitlement, the automatic default privilege of a certain kind of what we now call cis white male, for sure. Now, to ask how those movements could have proceeded differently so as to not touch this off, you know what worries me? I both love that question, and I want to say it wasn't the job of those movements. It's like we don't need to victim blame. It's not the job of those movements to anticipate the ego needs of this this creature, right? But the point of that question is also so critical, which is actually a present question as well. How to do this, right? How to actually acknowledge that all of these movements do make requests, if not demands, of white men. They are asking them to change. They are calling them to share. They are calling them to vulnerability. Conversations about toxic masculinity are inviting men to stop engaging in destructive behaviors that also hurt them, right? So it's all of these movements, if one listens, are invitations to make your own life better as a straight white man. They literally are. Just not through entitlement, not through being the only one on the perch. And so I think that the challenge now is to, on the one hand, acknowledge that there is some sort of unsettling uncertainty struggle that many, not all, young white men face, and particularly if it's compounded by class inequities or other things like that. I very much care about those quandaries, right? I do think that needs attention. That's what pro-feminist men's movements, which are also many of them anti-racist, have been working on. I want to separate, those are real struggles. The movements contribute to those struggles, not in some way that they can be blamed for, but by raising important questions, right? Okay.
Right.
So I don't know that it's like movement job to do this, but we do need to attend to the, like, I don't know, holes and fissures and tensions and losses that aggrieved manhood is currently filling, you know?
Right. And
Yeah.
so I guess what I'm wondering is aggrieved manhood inevitable?
No.
Okay, thank God.
And as soon as I said that, I find it to be a hopeful statement.
Good.
I mean, I guess if I thought that, backlash is a pattern. We've seen that, right? A lot of movements, like, for example, and this, by the way, is one of the kind of central cases in the book. I know that you all, the history of your podcast comes out of conversations in the wake of George Floyd's murder.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, all of the movements that are reinvigorated or launched out of that moment in time, this current sort of anti-CRT, anti-woke everything is a backlash. A backlash motivated by what I call aggrieved masculinity, which always also involves race, sexuality, all these other things.
Good old-fashioned racism.
Yes, and it's a backlash. This is a backlash movement. Now, I think that it gives us a really good example in response to your question, because what we can do is, instead of like trying to say, okay, no, like, let's argue your points. What do you mean don't say gay? Like, here's why LGBTQ stuff is necessary, or don't be anti-DEI or Black history. This stuff is necessary. Instead, we could look at how those campaigns are successful. We could look at the CRT thing in particular as a good example. Bracket what it says. How many times have I said this? To focus on how it spreads. And what these backlash movements are doing that are driven by aggrieved manhood is basically, they're like branding projects. They don't care about the debate. They hitch a ride on all kinds of content, all kinds of ideology, misinformation, conspiracy theories, whatever. But the content is not the point. The point is to get people to have these knee-jerk, automatic, like, responses, like you would to a brand of any product. Right? So like Kleenex, oh, I want this, or, this is my favorite, whatever. So it's like CRT, ew, right? It is that like physical aversion is the point of the culture war, not deliberation about ideas, about how race should be taught in schools, right? When you realize that, instead of continually arguing the points, you start like thinking, how do we fight culture wars like this? If it's all a brand, it's never mere branding, because what I'm suggesting is these so-called branding wars have huge consequences in the world, right? They are killing us, and they are killing Black and brown people. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So huge consequences, but the battle is being fought over feeling, over bodily reflex, over aversions and attachments. And I don't think that the left engages in culture wars in that way. And for that reason, I think that they are losing.
This is exactly what I think, although you said it way better than I could have ever thought. It's exactly what I think when I go to the local school board meetings.
Oh my goodness, do you?
Yeah, and a certain group of parents wants to ban books to our children, and a certain group of other parents that I happen to sit with doesn't want to ban books. Yep. And we go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I feel like we're not fighting this war appropriately, because I think you're right. We don't have the emotional response. How do we begin to learn? And I don't even like the term "fight the war," which is probably part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
I want to be civil and convince, and I don't know. It's probably part of the problem.
It's a different, it's like you're playing on a different value field, right? Like you just said, like dialogue, civility or whatever, deliberation, ideas, debate, like, no.
Right. I don't want to fight. I don't want to fight.
Yeah, right. And their goal is to win the debate at the physical level, at the sensory level, where people just go, ew, gross, this, not this, fear, anxiety, right? So
Right.
how do you begin to engage in that? I mean, for me, there's kind of like an interpersonal version of this, which is when someone is continually coming at you with claims and arguments and getting more and more animated, as you must be seeing at the school board. Sometimes it's best not to engage with the content and to ask instead, what are you afraid of? What is this like get to the level of feeling, or are you okay? Like you, you know, I mean,
Are you okay?
honestly, just pausing refusing to meet heat with heat around issues as if the issue is what we're talking about, right? It isn't.
So we can't be on their playing field. We have to have a new playing field.
Or
right?
you
Because
like, yeah, I'm
are
not
on their playing field and it's just all about anger and what you call in the book anger management by anger. If we don't play on that field, and we don't play on the field that we're currently playing on as the left, what do we do?
Yeah. I'm not suggesting just switching to their field and fighting on it. Do you know what I mean?
Thank God. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm definitely not suggesting that. But I am suggesting expose the register in which they are fighting.
Okay.
It is a pretense that it's about ideas, ideologies, principles, right? So expose that the animating thing here is that you don't want to give up your privilege. Now, how? I mean, that's not what you would ever say, but
I might.
Well, I might too, depending on who I'm talking to.
My interpersonal examples were all about like, I want to register your rage. Like you are I get it. It's really intense for you. What is most threatening here for you at that level? You know? So I mean, I'm imagining if you scale this up, this is why I, in the book, keep calling for name it for what it is, make it visible to people so that people can just begin to say, climate denial, rolling coal, aggrieved manhood, mass shooting. We always go over and over. What are the motives for each particular person? And then is it race or gender or sexuality or more one or this?
Oh, is it mental
illness? It's aggrieved manhood. Yes. And so if we had conversations, for example, as we do about mental illness and guns, those are the two things we go to. And then sometimes people will note casually, but nobody knows what to do with it. It's mostly white boys of a particular kind or white men of a particular kind, but nobody really knows what to do with that. Well, then we need to look at how is that feeling spreading, right? So this was the idea of like tackling the manosphere. I mean, we tackle all kinds of information security and hate kind of threats, and we give a free pass to so much stuff that goes under the name of misogyny. We need to turn to the register on which they are fighting and address that register. That is not to say we need to fight like they fight. I'm not convinced that whoever the we is here, but for example, folks on the left couldn't be a bit smarter. Couldn't political strategists be a bit smarter about like doing a little branding of their own?
That's why I want everyone to read this. I swear, I think this needs to be shipped like in bulk to journalists and TV stations and think tanks and political strategists. I swear to God, it should be required. And everybody in Florida.
Can I hire you? No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, sure. I will totally be your hype woman. Everybody needs to read this book. Both sides of the aisle. Swear to God.
And everybody is for both sides of the aisle. Yeah. I mean, that's ultimately my point, is that across political divides, what we're talking about here transcends even all the fuss over threats to democracy. Both sides claim that democracy is in peril, but we're talking about something that could kill the planet, that is killing us, that is literally a public health problem, and it is killing the very people who claim to be its beneficiaries. No one is winning. And that is our common stake, I think, in this.
Right.
It's precisely this. And it can transcend politics, but, that's a long road.
You wrote something in the beginning of the book that just made me think of. You wrote, I write about aggrieved masculinity from this place, not because it comes easy, but because for the love of one another and the planet, we need to find another way fast. That was the first thing I underlined. And that is what my kids and I talk about all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
That other way, we need to be able to envision it and come at it from another angle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is what I hope to provide, is just an unusual, different, and promising angle. So,
And you do, because you talk
Mhm.
towards the end of the book about critical thinking versus critical feeling. That really stuck to me. I thought about that a lot after I read the book. Can you explain it?
yes, I'd love to. Let's take, for example, misinformation, disinformation, anti-conspiracy theory, like these kind of campaigns that we have now,
Yes.
which all of these campaigns acknowledge, hey, this stuff is circulating, right? This
Mhm.
stuff is flowing around and we need to stop the spread of information, right?
Right.
And so we need to give people the tools to think critically about the evidence and data and claims that they see coming at them. So all of that is what I would still call the paradigm of critical thinking, which is super important, right? It
Mhm.
like gives you the tools to say, is this good information? Who would I be if I didn't believe this information? What do
Mhm.
people on the
Mhm.
other side of it say? What else could be, critical thinking is an established paradigm of fighting these sorts of things. How do you fight in this contemporary media landscape the transmission of feeling, where people are drawn to, for example, Christian nationalism or white supremacy on the basis of like, yeah, straight white men have been ripped off, and don't really even like process how that entered them in the first place. Like, how
Mhm.
did they get in contact with that feeling? How did it grow? How did it accumulate? All those questions. So critical feeling would be a paradigm that meets the age we're in and the social media and kind of political media landscape in which we operate. And we have not developed it, but there are like there's,
Mhm.
I won't bore you with the nerd details, but there are increasingly groups of scholars in several different fields who are working on this, the
Oh my God.
transmission of feeling. So how things kind of get in through physical communication, right? Like earlier we were talking about Gamergate and physical repetition and the thrill, how our
Right.
other senses are participating in our politics. Not
Mhm.
just ideas and information, not just emotions at that higher level you can express and articulate, but like physical urgencies,
Mhm.
bodily truths, felt truth. That's what critical feeling would do, is tackle those, is try to awaken all these other portals in our body in these mediated times that make us susceptible to certain kinds of feeling. And then we fall into all the ideologies that they're writing on.
One thought that kept coming up for me reading your book,
Mm-hmm.
Karen, is that all of this is pretty subversive. How are people reacting to this? What
Mm.
responses are you getting from people about your book? I mean, I love that it's subversive, so I don't use that in a negative way. This is literally taking common thought and turning it on its head, which I thoroughly appreciate. And I really wonder what, and I'm trying to find where I wrote it, but there's literally one section in your book where I wrote subversive in the in the
I'd love to
margin.
know where that was. I'd love to know how you see it that way.
I will totally find it, but I wrote it in a good way.
People who hear talks or when I do interviews or things of that sort, there's a fair amount of resonance. But I think that in terms of wider circulation, there is an obstacle just in the fact that it centers gender and argues that gender is the way, like the displacement of the straight white man is the way that this phenomenon is moving around the world. I cannot tell you the resistance of folks to that idea. Like, it can't be gender. It can't be gender. Like, that's just too, there's something that I think feels old school to people. I think that like it's some sort of old school feminism, maybe, which if anything, it's the opposite.
Based in old school ideas about manhood and entitlement.
I have not yet been able to articulate or put my finger on that part of the resistance. I think the thing I am called to do the most is defend why gender explains anything, because look, politics has been a male domain for a long time. And so why does masculinity explain anything? And that is a hurdle for me. I'm still working on how to, beyond just like, please look at what's in front of you, look at the dynamics of what is in front of you, or close your eyes and sense this rage, like its qualities, whose it is, on whose behalf. If you don't do that, you're going to keep saying it was the recession, it was migration, it was, you know what I mean? That I think is my hardest sell, I would say.
Could it be that because white men are the default? I know it sounds a little simple to put it that way, but that's the gender part of it. White men are the default.
You bet. I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more. And I also would say that the kind of editors and gatekeepers who have this response, who are often, of course, white men, I should have maybe noted at the outset that Aggrieved Manhood comes in many flavors and intensities. And some of those flavors might be called like decaf, or, you know, they have a low ABV, low ABV. And it's like, maybe like a white male, very successful editor who says, you know, me too, like things went a little too far. Are we going to reduce everything to gender? Like, I don't really think we need, and the gender angle's been covered. I've actually seen that very phrase, heard that very phrase many times. Let me give you one other example. At the book launch here in Denver, two very left-leaning white men said to me, jokingly, "Oh no, are we going to be in trouble after we hear it? Like, what is this? Is this going to tell us why we're bad again?" And so I understand the reaction, but it is actually what we are talking about. It's a decaf version of what we're talking about. So I don't know. To me, there's some kind of layers to cut through where this is not a phenomenon that always takes the extreme and intense forms. You know, to get legitimacy for a gender analysis means asking people to drop their own aggrieved manhood to be able to consider it. And that can include, as we've just said earlier, women too.
That's brilliant. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't ask you? Any main sticking points that we didn't cover?
I feel like we covered so much. Thank you for a wide-ranging conversation. And the puffer fish, I didn't think that would come up. That was great.
That's my favorite part.
I would say, as books of this sort go, I am most interested in the intervention potential of critical feeling. I'm so appreciative that you see it as subversive. That excites me because that's what I would have hoped. But I don't just mean it for it to be a subversive analysis. I want it to be like subversive in its potential for action and new practices. And I see those practices ranging, you've covered several of them, both of you, but it ranges from like, I mean, education. So people who do what I do, thinking about teaching critical feeling, what would that look like? Journalistic practices, calling it out, naming it, owning your participation in it. Tech folks of all kinds, algorithms that are pushing through the manosphere, all of this kind of sentiment, for example, but also families, like raising boys who are exposed to this. What do you do about it? Like critical feeling envelops kind of all these different sites and possibilities for action, some of which are well beyond my purview, you know, given what I do. But I know that like knowledge is out there. So it's just a call to action on many fronts, I guess, is what I would say.
Love that.
Karen, thank you so much for, first off, for writing this book and tackling this topic and writing the book in such a way that I feel is very accessible, because it's really easy to look at this and think, whoo, no, that's just not gonna, I'm gonna have to choke down reading that book. Oh Lord, it's gonna take all day, right? But this is a tall order and you tackled it so well. And like I said, it's accessible, and in some ways it's a fun read. I mean, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. Yeah.
Now that's amazing given the subject matter. That's the highest compliment yet. Thank you. I did have a fair amount of laughter in writing it, you know?
Good.
I can see that.
You have to.
Good. Yeah. Everybody, please buy this book. Buy this book. Read it. It is so good. Let us know how people keep responding to your book. I can't wait.
Thank you so much for an excellent and super stimulating conversation. I enjoyed you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
I always talk first. I'm going to just let you talk first. I'm going to control myself for a minute. Go ahead.
I was going to let you talk. We like to talk first, so I was going to let you go. All right. I will say the part that really stuck out to me in the conversation, lots of it. I think there was actually some really practical advice for going to the school board meeting around, I wrote it down, name it for what it is, aggrieved manhood. I think that we can work that angle instead of having this incessant fight back and forth, we can start naming it for what it is. And I really liked her idea of asking, are you okay? Because I feel like that just calls it out and puts it on the table.
Yeah, it's like, y'all ain't all right. Can we talk about it?
The second thing that I really loved was when she talked about decaf flavors, decaf light or whatever it was. Because, okay, people arguing about whether it is gender. I'm like, people, are you paying attention? I can just say, as a woman in my 50s who's been on countless online dating sites and talked to men from all over the freaking United States, or at least Michigan, all men that I have met, I won't say all men because I haven't met them all, but all men that I have met have at least some part of decaf light. And that is one of the reasons I have trouble dating, because the decaf light of the Me Too went too far and all of the other things that she mentioned. Screw that. It's not. Me Too never went too far, and it's not over. Okay, your turn.
I've touched on, this is like my nerd jam. All of it. The way that she introduced the topic of aggrieved manhood and how that ties into populism and how it ties into what's going on with our society, but then comes around with how we can make things better. At the core, at the end of it, I don't know about you, but when I finished this book, I felt hopeful.
I did too.
Yeah, I really did. I felt hopeful at the end of it, like, okay, this can be done. The end or disaster is not inevitable. We can still stave off disaster, but we have got so much work to do. And we need to come together to do it and figure out how to actually talk to each other and listen to each other so that we can have the conversations and do the work that needs to be done.
And the critical feeling is a huge piece that I plan on doing a little bit more research around. Critical thinking, yes, we need to teach those skills. Yes, it's necessary. Critical feeling could be how we could change the world.
Really looking at, where are those feelings coming from? How did they start? How are they spreading? What's underneath it?
Brilliant book. I loved it. I know you both said it was truly accessible. I believe it is. It was a little harder read for me than it was for you. I had to stop and think about the concepts and the chapters as they went by. But by the time it wrapped to the end, I feel like I understood it. I feel like I understood it even more. Well, we were blessed to have this conversation.
Absolutely.
So having the conversation, I feel like, oh, it clicked into place.
I truly hope that more people have this conversation. I think it's truly helpful. And like I said, this is a hopeful book. I would hate for people to look at it and just go, oh, here's another man bashing whatever. No, this is hopeful.
Actually, now that you say that, I didn't think this was a man bashing book at all. And I think it's important we say this. I think this was actually a book that was about loving men and wanting them to have a better earth experience as well, for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah.
It's a man loving book. It's a human loving book.
It's a human loving book. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Bye, Raquel.
Bye, Jennifer.
Thanks everyone for listening today. We will be back with more Madness Cafe next week. You can find us on Instagram at Madness Cafe Podcast or email us at madnesscafepodcast@gmail.com. Bye.